Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final colloquium in this inaugural year for the College of Arts and Humanities Race, Equity, and Justice campaign. I'm Bonnie Thornton Dill, Dean of the College and Professor in the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. As most of you know, the RHU Race, Equity, and Justice campaign has as its goal the understanding and dismantling of structural racism. We seek to do this through work that transforms curriculum, reduces discrimination in teaching, research, and service, and expands the impact of RHU's longstanding and continuing scholarship on racism, anti-racism, equity, and justice. Also, consistent with President Pine's focus on racial justice and identity, we are pleased to welcome students participating with us as part of the Terrapin Strong onboarding program. In RHU, part of our approach is to offer opportunities for our students to be exposed to the many different faculty in the college who study and teach about these issues. Over the year, I have invited faculty experts from across RHU to discuss their scholarship and creative projects related to anti-racism and social justice. We've heard from faculty in art, theater, history, American studies, and today we will hear from a faculty member in English. And the format of each session includes a brief presentation, followed by conversation with me, and then an opportunity for you to ask questions. I hope many of you are returning and have enjoyed this series as much as I have. It's been a real privilege to be able to spotlight some of our excellent faculty and their work, and hopefully introduce you to them and their work, and to give you a sense of everything or some of the things that are going on in the college. So we ask that your microphones remain on mute. And during the last 15 minutes, you'll be invited to submit questions through the chat, which is being moderated by Associate Dean Linda Aldury, who will manage the question and answer. And please note, this event is being recorded for future viewing on the college website. So today's session features Jershon Aviles, Associate Professor of English. Dr. Aviles specializes in contemporary African-American and diasporic literature, where he explores how gender and sexuality inform artistic production. His first book, which was published in 2016, Radical Aesthetics and Modern Black Nationalism, won the 2017 William Sanders Scarborough Prize from the Modern Language Association. Dr. Aviles has also written several essays on a range of subjects, including the Black Arts Movement, race and terror, Black women's writing, and the Harlem Renaissance. Today, Professor Aviles will discuss his recently published book, Black Queer Freedom, was published in 2020, and he'll talk about how Black queer artists explore spatial inequality that is resistant to legislative change, specifically change based on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So please welcome and join me in welcoming Dr. Jershon Aviles. Jershon.
Hello, thank you so much for the introduction. And again, thank you for letting me be a part of this really fantastic series. It's really exciting to be among these very innovative and exciting scholars. So I'm glad to be here. So I want to just share a small piece of my new book, Black Queer Freedom, which I'll show you. Maybe you can see it. It's a really beautiful image. I forgot to send I could have sent the image around, but you can at least see it right there. So I'll talk a bit about the book, and hopefully that will open up for a conversation. So in the book, I examine how queerness introduces the threat of injury. Artists throughout the Black diaspora detail this kind of injury, but they also use representations of queer desire to imagine freedom from restriction. I'll focus my comments today on a couple of poems by Black lesbian poet Pat Parker to illustrate this back and forth between injury and freedom that I highlight throughout the book. Parker was born in 1944 and grew up in Houston before moving to Los Angeles in the early 1960s. She was involved with the Black Panthers and founded the Black Women's Revolutionary Council in 1980. She also actively sought out collaborative projects with women's organizations. She published 5 books of poetry before succumbing to breast cancer in 1989. When she was growing up, a young gay boy in her neighborhood was beaten and thrown in front of a car. Because Parker is around this young man's age, she can't help but identify with him, and there's a way in which this death is imprinted on her memory. Early on, she learns a lesson about the precarity of queer life. Queer individuals are deemed to be dispensable, and they face injury even from within their own communities. This young queer child faced a particularly public death, in part because he was perceived as being socially different. Perceptions, or how one's body gets read socially, can result in violence, particularly for those seen as different or non-conforming. Parker carried with her the recognition of the vulnerability of the queer body, especially in public spaces. She's sensitive to a kind of spatial vulnerability of women and sexual minorities, and she asserted a right to space for these groups throughout her work. Her poetry I read as an ongoing meditation on spatial justice, which I define as the ability to have access to and move freely through space, the social world. The idea of the threat of injury dominates 2 poems in particular, one called The Law, another called Boots Are Being Polished. The first questions the notion of respecting the law when legal institutions often do damage to defenseless populations. The poem intimates that there is no place safe from the injurious influence of the law's presence. The poem reads, "The law comes to homes and takes the poor for traffic tickets." A mere traffic ticket could lead to police presence in domestic space, as we all will know, and perhaps much worse, reflecting the idea of the near absolute vulnerability of the populations upon which she wants to shed light. From her perspective, a felony and a minor traffic violation are almost indistinguishable from the perspective of the law when one is marginalized. Parker goes further by suggesting that the law can even trespass the space of the domestic so that there is no getting away from law's grasp. Being at home, being in domestic space does not mean you're safe from this kind of pressure and presence. This idea of the inescapability of the law lies at the heart of the kaleidoscopic poem, Boots Are Being Polished, which is also published as Where Will You Be? The poem prompts the reader to consider if and how they will respond to threats against minority populations and suggests our collective involvement in social abuses. The basic conceit of the poem is that we often ignore the plight of the oppressed, and worse, are often complicit in that oppression, even though we might face the same dangers. The poem's refrain, "Where will you be?" is meant to indicate that the threat is coming and inevitable. No matter where you go, it's going to be there, but it's also meant to indict the reader. The poem is an extended meditation on coming threat. It reads, "Where will you be when they come? They will not come a mob a-rolling through the streets, but quickly and quietly move into our homes and remove the evil, the queerness, the faggotry, the perverseness from their midst." There are 2 primary moves that occur in the poem. The first is the inquiry, "Where will you be?" That suggests that there's no place where you can be protected from the reach of juridical power. The idea that where could you possibly go is going to be everywhere. Much of the first part of the poem details how an ominous they will come and threaten everyone's lives. Any movement through the social realm is a movement away from the omnipresent threat. The poem outlines an inevitable and destructive invasion of privacy and indicates that privacy and domestic space are unstable concepts and not guaranteed, especially for minority populations. The threat of the public makes its way into private spaces. The second component of the poem is an indictment of our collective failure to protect others. The speaker insists, quote, Every time we watched a queer hassled in the streets and said nothing, it was an act of perversion. So she's really flipping or inverting this idea of what perversion is and who is actually the perverse person, the perverse population. She used the language of perversion to describe sexual nonconformity and to characterize our lack of sympathy with other queers. We ignore the spatial restrictions placed on others' bodies and perhaps even our own. It is this failure to recognize and care for fellow queers, those bound by potential injury, that constitutes our own perversity. We are perverse because we refuse to acknowledge and act on our connection to our peers. Parker's audience and many of her readers were often queer people, which is why she relies upon the you and the we. There's a shared identity between the reader, the listener, and the hassle queer the speaker references. The perversion in the poem results from a failed sense of kinship. The kinship here is not precisely the racial kinship that dominates much of the revolutionary thinking of the 1960s and 70s, the kind of what she's writing out of, the period she's writing out of. Parker imagines the kinship of queerness in the poem and uses it as a tool to galvanize the community in the presence of the threatening nature of the public, and particularly here, the state. Going further, Parker does not simply point out the reality of spatial constriction. Through connecting to the past, she argues for new social space that is free of constraint and that achieves the goals of spatial justice, shedding light on spatial conflict and asserting a right to the access to the public realm. And here's a poem that I think really kind of hammers that point home. In the 1973 poem, It's a Simple Dream, it exemplifies this poetic call for social space or access to space. The poem plays on Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous 1963 March on Washington speech. It builds on King's iconic rhetoric and incorporates the dreams of other activists such as Malcolm X, Angela Davis, and George Jackson. The speaker creates, in doing this, a radical genealogy and situates herself in it. The nature of this dream in the poem is one of movement. Quote, "In my dream, I can walk the streets holding hands with my lover. I can go to a public bathroom and not be shrieked at by ladies. In my dream, I can walk ghetto streets and not be beaten up by my brothers." Political activism and the reproduction or the production of the public realm appears here as dreaming as the dream. The Black freedom movement for Parker Speaker is about mobility, literal movement. The acts of getting food, going to the bathroom, walking down the street can be challenges in the current world for many people, but not one that is imagined in some of these freedom dreams. That which cause the speaker's distress and negative interactions are not only public displays of same-sex affection, but also non-normative gender expressions. The ladies in the bathroom shriek at the speaker, likely because she is a butch, meaning that her gender expression aligns more with traditional masculinity, so she is not perceived as belonging in a women's restroom. Her sexual desire and her gender expression endanger her. For the Black queer speaker in the poem, this negative reaction as she enters the bathroom is tantamount to being denied entrance. The shriek works as a symbolic act of interruption that impedes movement. The speaker's experience has layered behind it the long history of racial segregation that included the denial of access to public facilities such as bathrooms, an important element of the social restrictions against which King and other activists set their dreams. The denial of access to public spaces is not new for Black people. And Parker taps into that history as she imagines what is an all too familiar scene of the interruption of Black queer movement. The existing Black freedom dreams may not account fully for these vectors of immobility. The speaker evokes these previously stated dreams of other activists, but finds that she must also point to other possibilities. She does not want to yield to an unsatisfying method of social redress. The world that she imagines is one defined by freedom of movement and the proprietary access to the social realm. She's making a claim for spatial justice and calling for us to imagine the world otherwise. Black queer bodies then might be surrounded by injury, but art's ability to give those bodies the space to move and to love might be the space of freedom most readily at hand. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Jershin. There's lots to unpack in what you shared with us, but why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about how you came to this particular set of problematics that you wanted to explore around space and even the notion of spatial justice and freedom, but kind of what led you to these questions? Tell us a little background.
Sure, and I'll try to keep this brief because this could be the whole conversation is talking about how I got to this book. But I think I got to the project as a whole really as I was finishing my first book. And the first book is all about the legacy of the 1960s and how that impacts kind of contemporary art and activism. And the book ends by thinking about how Black queer artists tap into the energy from the 60s and kind of make it their own. And I wrote that part, and I think I was left with this question of, for myself, what would a book dedicated solely to Black queer artists look like? Because I hadn't really seen one before, and there weren't that many around. I mean, of course, there are works that kind of talk about sexuality and Black artists, but have a book be dedicated to their projects. Mm-hmm. So I think that question became my question, and I started doing a bunch of talks and thinking about it and teaching classes about it. And I think, as I was doing those talks and thinking about the work, I got to a different kind of question that was about how to think about Black sexuality and social justice. I think that's really how I got to this book. And the book in many ways is about, in my attempt to understand Black queer artists' projects, I found myself returning to the questions of reimagining the terms of social justice and social justice activism through artistic projects. I think that's how I got here. So the interest in the Black queer art kind of got me to this question through their work, right? To this, because their work and the work across the Black diaspora kept asking these questions about access and space and intrusion and invasion and kind of interrupted, compromised privacy. Like, these are ideas, as opposed to kind of my kind of coming up with all this on my own. It really is attending to what artists and activists were saying and kind of trying to think about how to make that a project. I think that's how I got here to this, with, of course, years of thinking and writing, but that's kind of the path of how I got here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think this whole idea about reimagining the notion of social justice through the eyes of these writers, but also through your framing of it is really interesting. People have been talking a lot lately about kind of the limitations on mobility for Black people. And I think what you do here, at least as I hear you talking about this, is complicate this even further and talk about the additional limitations, the lack of access to bathrooms or other things like that for Black queer people. And so I mean, I'm just interested in hearing you talk a little bit more about that. I mean, I know you picked these two poems by Pat Parker, but I think that this chapter also involves the work of Cheryl Clark and others. And so it's kind of their quest for, so you start with injury and you end with freedom. So talk a little bit about that.
Sure, let me write that down. I want to answer in two ways. The first is, yes, because you began by talking about how the work tries to complicate how we think about realities of social restriction, right? I mean, thinking about, because it's hard not, especially in the US context, not to think about, when we think about segregation, that's literally about social restriction and where people can and can't live. But what I'm also trying to do in that complication, and I think this is what the work shows us, there's a questioning of this idea about social progress, right? There's kind of a social progress narrative that goes along with the civil rights movement. Like, we get the Civil Rights Act that is ostensibly on paper, what it is really trying to do is to guarantee the right to freedom of movement in public spaces. That's actually what the document tries to do, in addition to trying to get rid of limitations on voting and job restrictions. But a big part of the act itself is about guaranteeing freedom of movement through space. And I think part of what these artists are doing is saying, even in like directly after that, there are all these ways in which that restriction is still readily denied. But on top of that, when we think very carefully about vectors of gender and sexuality, we understand that the idea about change over time becomes a little questionable, right? The idea that there actually has been this guarantee or this realization of freedom of movement through the public realm it's not even questionable. It's like, it's not true, right? And so it's really kind of enhances this critique of this kind of post-racial, post-civil rights moment, that we're kind of beyond this moment when really the moment of racialized segregation, like that the idea that we're beyond that. These kinds of works say laws have changed, some policies have changed, but people's actual experience might not have, which in effect would be a failure of that legislation. If the legislation hoped to recreate social space, people lived experience doesn't change, then that it puts pressure on how we understand the effect of legislation. And then your last point about injury to freedom. So, and this gets in some ways to the heart of the book, because much of what I'm talking about and trying to very carefully lay out is the complex reality of injury when you're talking about anti-Black racism alongside kind of sexism, homophobia, what the different kinds of injury that manifest from that intersection. And every chapter is really about that. But what was important to me was to not allow injury to become the full story of these artists and activists' lives or how we understand Black queer identity. And I think every single artist I talk about in this book very carefully makes us think about the reality of injury, but every single one also wants us to understand the possibilities for pleasure and play and freedom, even if those experiences end, even if they're temporary or fleeting. They never want to lose sight of the possibility of play. Again, this is why a kind of a key trope for the book is freedom and restriction. And I think that freedom is not less important because of those realities of restriction. It is still just as important. And so in some ways, it's not even just a movement from injury to freedom. The entire book is this interplay back and forth between it, because that becomes the experience, I think, of occupying this kind of positional space in society. You can't ever get away from that possible threat of injury, whether that's death or whether that's humiliation, discrimination, but that you also always find ways for pleasure and possibility or respite in that context.
I think that's really important to hear you say, because as I was listening to you talk about kind of the limitations of social justice and legislation, and then kind of people have argued, well, legislation makes the space for change. We can't focus on individuals, hearts and minds changing. So then it's like, well, where is the space for change, for hope, for possibility, for freedom, really? And so hearing you talk about that as a space that exists in Pat Parker's poem In Her Dreams, but through people's literature, in a way. Talk a little bit about that. Becomes a space for freedom.
I would love to. Thank you for that, because that's in some ways that idea that you're articulating now is the point toward which I'm moving throughout the entire book. And so I'll put it this way. So basically in the book and through the artists, I'm asking this question: given the histories we have, not only in this country, but around the world, because the fact of the matter is anti-Black racism is a global phenomenon, not just in the United States, but given that fact, can we trust the state to make change? Like, that's kind of the question. And what I'm trying to say in this book is, yes, sure, we can do that, but that should not be our only focus for hope. We can, because if we always just depend on the state, my argument is that the state's always going to let you down. It just is. The state institutions are going to let you down. So if that is where you put all of your energy for social redress, you're going to be disappointed. However, and part of the argument of my book is we have to understand that for many populations, many people, art becomes a means for social redress. Art offers a kind of freedom that the state has kind of kept at bay, the state is denied, or the state can't even imagine yet. So I think about, I'm not talking in my conclusion about what I call artistic redress, thinking about how artists, what art does for us is offer us a way to imagine ourselves in the world that kind of give us what we want, but or also give us that kind of peace and freedom. That's actually art's function, as opposed to art simply responding to the social world. Art itself is a means of accessing freedom, right? And so I'm not at all, I don't wish to say here that we should just divest ourselves from the state. Like, I don't even care about that argument. Like, let the state do its thing, and we can definitely kind of reap benefits from it and ask for change from the state. I'm just also making the argument that we shouldn't just think about that as a means to freedom. And I think that's what these artists are actually saying. They're finding freedom for themselves through cultural production, and also offering that freedom to the world by circulating their works.
I like your emphasis on the imagination, because, you know, I sometimes wonder, or you think about someone like Harriet Tubman. Where does the imagination, where does the vision of a different life, of a different possibility come from? So even if the state is saying X, Y, and Z, and it's not responding in the ways that you think it should, where does where do the ideas come from of something else that you can strive for? Some other ways to change the state, some other ways to make your life meaningful, some other ways. So, you know, I don't know, talk about that. Not asking questions, I'm just.
No, it's great though. But and again, I guess my first answer is really, again, to reiterate, is like art. I think art becomes one of those spaces. But another important part of the book is talking about intimacy, and intimacy meaning, of course, like romantic relations, but also kind of family and friendships and other kinds of kinships. And I think one thing I argue about the book is actually the precise means to freedom through art is often desire. And so I actually think, and when if your question is like, where do we go to imagine other possibilities? I actually think our interactions with others, kind of our intimate connections, our love relationships, they can be those spaces. But I think through those interactions, we imagine other possibilities. We imagine through our connection, we wonder, why can't the outside world be like this moment we have right now, right? I actually think intimacy, and I write a lot about, almost all my work's really about intimacy and thinking about it both as possibility and problem. Like, it's not to make it seem like it's the end of everything or it helps everything, but I actually think the interpersonal can be a space for imagining, especially when the social world kind of denies it or kind of delimits that possibility. So I'm very interested in intimate relationships throughout this project. I think as I'm thinking about every chapter, I kind of turn to intimate relationships every time. And sometimes they don't work out. Sometimes they're heartbreaking because they don't work out, but they still become valuable means for self-cultivation and a means for reimagining the world. So I would think art, but I also want to just make sure I talk about intimacy a little bit in this conversation.
So a couple of other questions, because as you talk about intimacy, I wonder how you think about the impact of and intimacy and imagination. I wonder how you think about the impact of social media and kind of new forms of communication and art making around these issues, and specifically around these issues of queer freedoms.
That's a great question. And I actually think the way, I guess first, I think that's actually exactly where to turn in the 21st century to think about, I'll say, cultural production. You know, whether we like it or not, that is, social media is an important space for artists to kind of share work, but also people to kind of cultivate their imaginaries. I think that is that's important to bring up. But funny is, in my work, I don't talk about social media. However, it's an important part of my teaching. So both in terms of how I introduce contemporary content to students related to what I'm teaching, but also it's increasingly become a means for rethinking assignments in class. So actually, I think it's that fits in my work more and along the same kind of conceptual lines of sexuality, social justice, anti-Black racism, but it's become a part of my pedagogy. It has not entered explicitly in my research, and except in how I, no, that's still teaching. Because I was gonna say how I think about when I, for example, if I'm teaching Pat Parker in class or Cheryl Clark or someone, and I want students to kind of understand those questions, and I will often, to put them, situate them in the contemporary moment, kind of use uh, Twitter and other kinds of images and videos to do that kind of work, to ask them kind of to juxtapose a poem with a blog post, for instance, to have us think about, because I'm always interested in the question of change over time. And in some ways, this social media question allows me to ask that, like, in thinking about moving from the 60s to the 21st century, something like that. So I think I have to answer your question by thinking about teaching. That's kind of how I would answer that question. Yeah, that's it.
Well, maybe that's your next book. But
Oh, funny, I just finished the book. No. No, I know what you mean. Yeah, no, and it's something to think about more. And that's what maybe this will answer your question more effectively. What's funny for me is oftentimes we think about as researchers that, you know, you research something and that informs your teaching, but I've actually found it to be the opposite, especially for this book. This book is so much a result of what I was teaching. So I had that kind of research question. And then for like 5 years, I was teaching courses and trying to figure out that question. So the questions my students would ask me about text and about these ideas, not basically provide the foundation for what I did in the book. So in many ways, this book is a reflection of my teaching courses on Black sexuality, social justice, and art and social activism, more so than I had this book project and I was kind of fitting it into classes. So in that sense, you're probably right. Like what I've been doing in the classroom will probably end up in this, the next project.
well, I mean, I was interested to hear about your teaching, and or I am interested to hear about your teaching, and because either undergraduates are on this call, or and certainly graduate students are, or will watch it, I was interested in hearing you say more about the relationship between your work and your teaching, and what you do teach, and how this.
Sure. So I think my primary two undergrad courses related to this project, I have a course called Black Sexuality in Literature and Film that I teach. It's kind of one of my regular courses that really asks us, I teach it in different ways, different levels, but asks us to think about what it means for an artist to use sexuality in a text. Like, what does sex do? And what does sex mean socially? And how does sex become a way to think about sex and sexuality, to think about these kind of social issues? What seems like a scene of intimacy might tell us something more. Here's an example. There's a short story that I talk about in the second chapter by Makeda Silvera. It's really about these, she's a Jamaican Canadian short story writer. And it's really about these two women in a relationship. And the entire short story, very short, takes place in their home. It's really about their kind of challenging relationship, communication problems. But what we come to learn in the short story is that, I mean, through talking about the relationship, we actually understand how dangerous immigration has been for both of them, how little community they both have, how precarious their employment opportunities are, and how they both are actually currently, in the short story, facing the possibility of sexual violation. Like, all this happens through this talking about this intimacy. I forget how I got off on this. Oh, teaching. Oh, so no, I forget. I'm awesome. I'm sorry. But I remember I was in, well, I lost that piece. Why I was talking about that short story. But all that matters is, I'm always having them think about, what is sexuality mean? Oh, sexuality as a means for other conversations. That's why. So the short story is actually about their kind of physical intimacy and emotional intimacy, but it becomes this long meditation on basically racism, sexism in Canada. Like, it's really what happens, but it happens through sex. So that class is one example of it. I have another class I teach called Art and Social Activism that really asks us to think about how social movements use art. and how art involves itself in social movements and moving from the 60s to the present. And so in many ways, you can kind of hear how that kind of book, that Kyle Haas, even if it's different from the actual book, is at the back of even this current book, and how it's something I'm always asked students to think about in a class where I actively use social media to think about those questions. And on the grad level, most of my classes are about Black queer theory. So I have a grad course called Art and Black Queer Theory that in some ways takes up this question of sexuality, but asks us to think about how the development of this field of kind of Black queer studies, queer of color critique, has an impact on and is actually in conversation with the work of creative writers and visual artists. So that's kind of two of the undergrad courses, three of the courses I've been working on.
Okay. Thank you. Well, one of the other things I want to ask you to comment on, just because, you know, as I mentioned in the introduction, one of the themes about in the Terrapin Strong initiative is about identity. So I wondered if you would, I mean, I hear a lot here, but I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about your work and how it informs notions of identity and how Black queer artists construct identity for people in the US today.
I would say, I think I have two quick responses. The first is going back to the talk the little short brief talk I gave today, just emphasizing when thinking about identity, how important experiences are, how important past experiences are to how we understand ourselves. So thinking again about Pat Parker kind of witnessing this murder, kind of being known about this murder, and it becoming in some ways that alongside, which I didn't mention in the talk, her sister was murdered. And so those two murders, I think, just shape her poetic output in these incredible ways, so that in who she is, her poetic persona in many ways. So kind of just keeping that in mind, the power that the past has on who we are. But the other piece is a lot of my work is about recognizing how we get read or seen in the social world impacts how we see ourselves. As much as, and I'll grant that, I mean, I think you do have a right to define yourself, like who you are is who you are. But a lot of my work and teaching is about understanding that, but also recognizing there's so much of who we are when that articulation of this is who I am, this is how I'm going to be in the world is still informed by how you get read in the social world, whether you like it or not. And I think that is the piece of identity that I want to keep in mind, that I don't want to neglect or not attend to perception as understanding that, and understanding that the I, the who you are, the identity is actually this kind of negotiation of the understanding of the self and how the world understands you.
No, that's very helpful and very clear, I think, in the work that you present. Linda, I'm looking at the time and I'm wondering if you have questions coming in that you'd like to.
We have a question, but I wanted to also encourage others to post your question in the chat at this time, since we have about 20 minutes left. So I'll go ahead and ask this question. Can you talk about the difference that form makes in this formulation of spatial justice? If we see art's ability to give these bodies the space to move and love across many forms of Black queer art, what are some of the ways that certain forms used by these creators do this in ways that are specific to those forms? Is that?
Yeah, that's actually, whoever asked that's a beautiful question. Thank you for offering that. And I think I will say that's the reason I appreciate that question is in part because I do not think that every single form, whether I'm talking about a novel, a play, a painting, works exactly the same way. I think that actually is really important to understand that forms work differently. And I think even if they're offering this kind of freedom, they might do so in different ways. Here's a brief example. So in the conclusion, I turn to the portraits and the photographs of Zanele Muholi, who's a South African artist, and make this argument that it's what she's doing in those photographs is, of course, offering a kind of freedom to, it's a series, several series of Black lesbians and non-gender conforming women. But she's offering them a kind of freedom by creating art with them. They're her collaborators, not just her subjects. But again, doing that through the photograph is its own kind of way of doing that. It's not the same as the novel. And in part of what she's doing is intervening in the long history of photography in South Africa and the ways photography was used to kind of help the colonizing apartheid project. So for her to use this form that has this history, to do that in the context of trying to articulate kind of a Black lesbian identity is a different kind of work than a poem that is playing with MLK's rhetoric. Does that make sense, right? That's different. So for me, I juxtapose them in the book because I think they're both doing that work of finding freedom and restriction. That being said, it is important not to keep in mind that form is different, that they do different kinds of work. And I think part of what both of my books have done is put different kinds of artwork together. So I'm trained as a literary critic, so I'm used to talking about novels, plays, and poems, but I tend to also talk about film and different kinds of other kinds of visual art. And I'm really inspired by the question of what does it mean to put different kinds of forms and genres beside each other? How can we learn better how to talk about artistic culture when we think broadly about art? So that's part of what the person asked the question, part of what you're picking up on is my tendency as a cultural critic to think across different forms and ask the reader to think about them in conversation while I still try to be kind of ethical and recognize that, and as the question said, the forms are very different. They have different histories and they do different kinds of work. And I'm willing to acknowledge that, but it's really important for me to think about things together, in part because artists talk to each other and learn from each other. And so many artists work across different forms that part of my criticism or my scholarship is about trying to understand how we develop a critical language to attend to those kinds of differences, but collectively.
Thank you. The next question is about the concept of freedom, and I'm going to put two questions together. Can you elaborate on your meaning of freedom? And then the next person says, adding to that, does freedom have a definition per se, or is it always relative and compromising?
So when I'm talking about freedom, particularly in this chapter, and I think maybe throughout, I'm actually talking about a kind of personal autonomy and ability to move through the world. So as I mentioned, I mean in some ways a literal freedom, literally in terms of the ability to move through space. And I think that because so much of the project as a whole, not just this chapter comes from the first chapter that's about movement kind of on streets. Let me say that quickly too. The first chapter is about movement on streets and actually interaction with police. The second chapter is on immigration. The third chapter is on jails. And the fourth chapter is on hospitals. So the first two chapters are about movement through space. The last two chapters are about movements through institutions. I wouldn't say that. And so I'm actually really interested in freedom. For me is about movement, the ability to move the body as one sees fit. So I actually kind of think of movement very literally, geographically and physically, but of course for me that has conceptual meanings as well, because it's not just the movement through space, especially when the institutional chapters, it's also about the freedom within oneself, the freedom to one's interiority. That's also what I mean by freedom. So I mean movement in a couple of different registers, which is why the second question kind of gets to what I'm doing with freedom, in that freedom is never just one thing, right? If freedom were absolutely definable, and that's kind of a more kind of legalistic understanding of what freedom is. Freedom is actually something that always eludes one. It's a way of understanding the self. So no one I'm writing about this book, it kind of achieves like, I now have freedom. Freedom, box checked. Freedom is something, it's an ongoing yearning for the self and the self's ability to move through the world. That's what freedom is, which again, as I'm defining it, that's not a definition in the classical sense, right? Because freedom for me isn't something that can be defined, but unfortunately, freedom is almost always understood in the context of restriction, because restriction precedes freedom, precisely because of the way the state works. And I won't go into that, but that's actually, freedom becomes that which we're trying to wrestle from control. And that's actually how I think about understanding. I mean, I understand and recognize that might not be how you all here think about it, but I'm just offering how I understand it, that restriction is first, and then we have freedom. The same way that I think we think about privacy, something that's kind of we have inherently. The way I think about privacy is actually we only have privacy to the extent that the state allows us to have it. privacy is tied to property. And any privacy we have effectively is because the state grants us. That's exactly why the state can impede on privacy anytime they want to, right? So there's something, and privacy is also something that certain populations have more than others, because privacy is about kind of a right to access that's granted by the state, so that the public, the state, precedes privacy. Privacy comes after that.
Next question. Since your work is interdisciplinary, what do you see as your responsibility or maybe ability to talk about images or visual work versus texts? Is this something your training in English or literary studies prepared you for?
That's a really great question. Did it prepare me for it? So in my training as a literary critic and my attention to detail, kind of, but actually no, I think no, it didn't. No. However, I consider myself to be a Black studies scholar. That's kind of how I understand myself in the world. And I think Black studies, because interdisciplinary and having to, even though my PhD is in English, having to become trained in Black studies during and after grad school required that I always be interdisciplinary. That actually has given me the tools I need to attend to the visual and the images more so probably than the PhD program itself. I think so. In other words, my attention to the visual comes from my own interest, but also I think my orientation through Black studies has helped give me the tools to do that. And then of course, having to kind of train myself as I wasn't trained as an art historian or visual cultural studies per se, just having me become one through the work. And honestly, through reading the work of actual trained art historians and people who do visual culture and trying to understand how they approach looking at something, because how they approach looking at a visual document is not at all how I would do it or what I would attend to really. That really it's less about do I notice the things, but how you attend to the image and then the world around the image and what led to the image. That I think that is what I learned, especially from people who aren't literary critics. Like how did that image get here and how was it constructed like that? And I learned that through studying art historians, which I got to through Black studies.
Okay, so this is in quotes from you, art is itself a way to access freedom. And the person is asking, what does that mean? What does it mean to say art in itself, or is itself a way to access freedom?
I mean that in two ways. The first is understanding that for many artists, their work is a way for them to create this world that we don't have. So for them, it's about a very personal freedom. But again, as I said, they're sharing it with us. And I think for a lot of us, art gives us a freedom that we don't have. And a great example of this, I know you've seen tweets and memes about this, but think about how the past year, many of us have been in lockdown, and what we've done since we couldn't leave the house is turn to television and books and poetry and amazing images through social media as a way to have pleasure and happiness and escape from our homes. But again, for me, art isn't, so that escapism piece is important, but art is not just about escapism. Art can help us to reimagine the world. So that what I mean by freedom is art's ability to help us reimagine social space and reimagine ourselves or understand ourselves differently. That's what I mean by freedom. Again, as kind of a elusive concept, but it's something that is about moving toward another way of understanding the self and the world around one.
Thank you. Those are all the questions that we have at this point. Bonnie, if you'd like to wrap it up or take it over. And you're still muted.
Yes, I know. I got it. I'm getting it. Just to maybe, I don't want another year of this to get it perfectly done. No, this is very interesting. It's particularly interesting to me because I'm co-chairing this task force on policing for the campus. And among some of the things that have come up, and of course, knowing African-American history, one of the key themes is movement, is freedom to move, freedom to be in certain places. So, I'm fascinated by the way you extend these notions of social justice and extend the notions of queer freedoms into and spaces and mobility. Because and Pat Parker's poem, because one of the things that police departments are talking about right now are things like don't do a ticket. Don't do stops for tickets, preemptory stops for tickets. You can just send people a notice, and that would avoid a lot of problems. So it was striking to me that you started the poem in that way. And I see that while I'm talking, questions are popping up. Maybe I'll let people continue to ask those questions, Linda, rather than going on to some of the others that I had. So.
Sure. And this question is, I think, maybe related to what you were talking about before, but in the context of jail. The question is, tell us about the experience of men in jail who experience freedom through art.
So that comes from that question related to my third chapter, which is focuses on the experience of Black gay men in prison and writing from Black gay men who have been incarcerated from the 80s and then one from the 21st century. And I'll keep it brief and say that part of what I say, particularly with the second half of that chapter, from a memoir written by someone who's in jail, is there's an attempt not to allow the narrative of self, this piece of life writing, be about vulnerability alone. Like it's hard not to imagine prison as a space that's not about vulnerability, particularly if you have a story, this narrative is about a Black queer man who's femme-leaning, so he presents in kind of traditionally feminine ways. Like that, I think our mind goes to, this is gonna be like a terrible tale. Regardless of his actual experiences in prison, his memoir it details the problems with the prison industrial complex. It details how difficult prison is and the racism, that's all there. But the narrative itself refuses to let vulnerability or injury be the story. It's really about, and it's actually kind of hilarious. I mean, the narrative is really about all these crushes he has. So we would imagine like rape, because rape is like what I haven't said yet. Like we'd imagine this would be a narrative about rape. He actually resists that being his story, even though he talks about sexual violation in the prison, but it's never about him. His desire through his kind of artistic work, through his creation of his memoir, is to create a persona who finds a freedom of intimacy and movement, even in the context of incarceration. And so what the chapter, what I do in terms of the entire chapter, is to show how these Black gay men actively point out the problems with incarceration and point out the particular, very, very particular vulnerability they do actually experience as Black gay men because of their visibility, their perceived visibility and their treatment. But they also work really hard, which is how the chapter fits in the entire book, as I was saying earlier. They don't want injury, vulnerability to be the entire story. In fact, that's what my entire book is actually about, how artists do this kind of careful, I forget the word for that. They do this kind of careful movement or negotiation to provide social critique through their art, but there's a way in which we could read Blackness as always already a side of injury, but they actually don't want that to be the case. They want this critique of the social world to be there so we never forget the discrimination they face, but they also don't want their identity to be defined only by injury. And so so in other words, even this is what I think is, for me, mind-blowing about in that chapter, even in the space of incarceration, the writer refuses to allow the narrative to be about injury and destruction and violation, even as we leave the text still knowing that happens. But in terms of this construction of this particular persona, the writer wants more. And that's what I'm trying to get to throughout the book by trying to think about, going back to the earlier question, art as a way to access freedom. Again, regardless of the difficulties of his actual experience, the story that he wants told, the public narrative that he wants out there, is that he is able to have this kind of autonomy and control and intimacy that's on his own terms. And that for him is a kind of freedom. Personally, at the same time, the text offers us a critique of what prison means as a Black gay man.
Do you think this refusal to allow the story to be a story of victimization? Is it survival strategy? Is it, what is it?
That's a good question. Is it? I think it's a survival strategy. I also think it goes back to your question about identity. It's a desire to define the self on one's own terms.
Mhm.
If you think about yourself, if you recognize and just the history and the reality of anti-Black race in this country, and you also recognize the seemingly ubiquitous kind of homophobia and femphobia in this country, it's hard. It might be hard. It might be hard not to feel as if you have no way of actually defining yourself. That you're kind of weighed down by those histories, which are not just histories, they're realities. Like they actually are how the world works. And I think it's a real desire to define oneself, just as I said, on one's own terms, and that becoming really important. I think that's exactly, and if we think about history of activism, so many Black activists and queer activists and Black queer activists, that's been an important part of their mission, is to define themselves on one's terms, even if those terms aren't ones that are socially acceptable, aren't ones that are politically correct, but to define oneself on one's terms itself as a means of activism, right? As a means of social critique, and that's part of what's happening here.
I think that's really very well said, and probably an excellent point to end on, because I think so much of what you're writing about, and so much of what we've heard people talking about through this series of presentations has been about kind of self-definition, claiming one's own space, telling one's own story, and being the owner, in a sense, of oneself, as opposed to being owned by, or the owner and definer of oneself, as opposed to being owned and defined by others.
Thank you.
So,
thank you for that. That was
yeah.
a good stuff. My work, but also the whole series. That was a great way to put it.
No, it is. It really does. So, Jershan, thank you. This has really been great. I thank all of you for attending and participating. Share these videos with your friends and colleagues. It will be posted in the next few days, in the next little while, and and send us your thoughts about what we should do next year to continue this kind of conversation. So, thank you. Thanks again, Jershan.
No,
And thank you all. Have a great day.